Hi there and welcome back, it's the Great Griff. I'm going to go over the presentation I gave for Unveiling Britain's Hidden History, which for those who don't know was an event held last Saturday in Caerphilly in memory of the late great Ross Broadstock, who tragically passed away last year. The event was a huge success and I'd like to give a shout out to Danielle and Lloyd from the Morganwg micronation of Indigenous people who did a great job of organising the event with Angie Broadstock. Another shout out to the boys who manned the camera, and we also had Arnie play some violin too, which was great. We had Marshall Abrahams, Rob Shaw, John Pilcher and Legolas, as well as my dad John Griffiths, giving some fantastic presentations, which collectively really did feel like it was an unveiling of the Britain's Hidden History project. It really was a day to remember, and I'm sure Ross would have absolutely loved it from where he is watching. I gave a presentation myself, which I'm going to recite now for those who couldn't make it. Enjoy. It seemed only fitting that my talk should be based on a topic which Ross gave me so much encouragement to pursue. This screenshot of Ross, my dad and me is from the day I told Ross all about the research I'd been doing, looking into the history of our history, or rather how it has affected British culture throughout the ages. Ross's enthusiasm for my ideas were hugely motivating, and I went on to write about this topic for my recent undergraduate dissertation. Ross is owed commendation for his services to history, but also I feel he is owed recognition for the fact that his love of history coincided with the love of the community which surrounded it. Becoming exposed to the world of Wilson and Blackett in 2020 caused me to want to ask the questions, why and how has this history become so hidden? Wilson and Blackett do answer these questions, but I needed to understand it through my own research, which is what I'd recommend anyone to do with any topic. I'm going to start my presentation with giving a contemporary representation of the old Comrick histories within modern British culture, given to us by C.S. Lewis, via an analysis of his book, That Hideous Strength by Cynthia Chung, at the Rising Tide Foundation, which is a talk on YouTube I'd highly recommend watching for those interested in the broader culture war that the West finds itself in, and particularly to do with matters such as the Frankfurt School of Thought and all that. That Hideous Strength is able to offer us a modern take on the presence of the Comrick narratives in Britain and its role in British culture and identity respectfully through his works of fiction. The reason I'm starting with this is because I feel that Lewis understood that these stories represented the forgotten truths of our heritage, and that there had been an effort to confine these stories to the realm of myth and fairy tale in order to achieve what Alan Wilson called political and religious correctness. In Lewis's 1945 novel, he illustrates his vision of two opposing British historical narratives, which each lend themselves to two opposing identities in the British collective psyche. One belongs to the ancient Britons and therefore resembles the old Comrick notions of Druidry, King Arthur, and Brutus of Troy, which represent not only the aboriginality of the Britons to the landscape, but having a connection with the great antiquities of the West as well, which have a mythic element which can lead to a perception of these narratives to harbour an elusive nature. This constituent is named Logres by Lewis, which is an allusion to Locrinus, the first son of Brutus, who was the first king of Logres. And this is meant to represent England, arguably alluding to a latent, unrealised and psychologically unconscious reality which is not overtly recognised. And this is in contention with England, which is presented as the overt, conscious and recognised identity of the peoples of this country. Lewis's theme corresponds with the later People of the British Isles study, the PIBI, conducted by Oxford University in 2004. This study found that the DNA of the English participants was only comprised of between 10 and 40% of Anglo-Saxon DNA, whilst retaining a substantial amount of DNA from the Brythonic-speaking peoples of what is now modern England. This study suggests that an intermarriage and integration between native Britons and Anglo-Saxons occurred, which dismisses the common myth of a total replacement of Brythonic DNA in modern England by the Saxons, and alludes to Lewis's theme of an unrealised Brythonic reality within the English genome. We mustn't forget that England to this day is referred to as Lloegr in Wales. We understand these histories to be associated closely with Griffith ap Arthur, or Geoffrey of Monmouth. But contrary to the mainstream understanding, Geoffrey of course didn't invent a quirky origin myth for Britain, but was actually bringing the ancient stories of this island to the audience of the Plantagenet courts. Geoffrey resided in Oxford, where he was a monk under a certain Walter, Archdeacon of Oxford. Allegedly, Walter would ask Monmouth to translate an ancient Welsh book which is claimed to have been the primary source for much of Monmouth's work. Academic consensus suggests that the location of this book has never been ascertained, which has usually resulted in the possibility being disregarded. It is conceivable that this subsequently adds to the elusiveness usually attributed to Geoffrey of Monmouth's work, which legitimises the sort of derision he is usually afforded. There are contenders for this manuscript available for historians to consider for the source of the content found in Historia Regum Britanniae. Brutus Silio, otherwise known as Brut Brynhenedd, which translates to the history of the kings, is one likely possibility. The authorship of Brutus Silio is attributed to Saint Silio, a monk born in the 6th century, who in his manuscript recites the Trojan origins of the Britons, which include a migration story telling of Brutus, the leader of the remaining Trojan exiles, embarking on a journey from Etruria, northern Italy, to Britain via Greece, Carthage and Gaul. Brutus Silio also mentions the building of a temple to Iesu Gris in Caerphilly, which is depicted as being a place in South Wales. It is evident here that Brutus Silio contains literary elements which resemble histories which will become closely associated with the Cambrian narrative, such as Jesus in Britain, Trojan origins, and the British Jerusalem. There have been debates among scholars regarding the claim that the manuscript is attributable to Saint Silio of the 7th century, however. Something which made my ears prick up, though, was that in 1917, archaeologist Sir Flinders Petrie made the argument that the claim of the attribution of the manuscript to Saint Silio can be made due to the presence of a colophon at the end of the manuscript, which is attributed to Walter, or Archdeacon of Oxford, which states, "I translated this book from the Welsh into Latin, and in my old age have translated it again from Latin into Welsh." And I think that the presence of this colophon is evidence strong enough to confirm that this is the ancient document which was the primary source for Geoffrey of Monmouth's The History of the Kings of Britain. Another good source to draw from when attempting to ascertain the longevity of these stories in Britain is the Welsh Triads, with the Triads being a written attempt to record the ancient Welsh stories which had been transmitted from generation to generation through an oral tradition. The fact that the triad of Prydain ep Eidd Mawr seems to be nearly identical to the history of Brutus cannot be overlooked. A fire which destroyed Glastonbury Abbey on the 24th of May 1184 afforded King Henry II of England an opportunity to align himself with the traditional narrative of this country, which would have been a useful political manoeuvre given that Henry's popularity was in a precarious position since the execution of Thomas à Becket. William of Malmesbury wrote in 1120 that the Glastonbury Abbey had relics and historical records of great antiquity relevant to the years of Christ. Henry II claimed to have found the grave of both Arthur and his wife Guinevere during the reconnaissance of the Abbey ruins. It is noted that Henry divined this as portents of his right to rule. Henry's attraction to the opportunity to be involved with the Arthurian mythos in some way illustrates the political clout of this narrative during the 12th century. It is understandable how this episode of history provides insight into how politically useful it must have been during this tumultuous period regarding the cultural identity of Britain and the overt cultural differences between the Norman ruling classes and the British and Saxon inhabitants. Around 100 years after Henry, history gives us a figure which can be considered extremely devastating to the expression of British culture. I am of course referring to Edward I. Let me start with one example which I feel perfectly captures the inversion of the meaning of our British relics, and that is the distortion of the original meaning of the title Prince. Edward Longshanks would colonise Wales following the assassination of Llywelyn ap Griffith. Longshanks promised that the people of Wales would have a prince that could speak no English. And this elusive promise was understood by the Welsh as a promise of a new Welsh sovereign. However, the trickery surfaced when Edward proclaimed his own baby son as the new Prince of Wales, who of course spoke no English or any other language for that matter. The title Prince of Wales remains a relic of English overlordship over Wales to this day, with only a brief interruption with Owain in 1404. The title Prince of Wales is traditionally afforded to the first son of the sovereign of the British throne, naturally relegating Wales to a status subordinated to England and disregards the idea of Welsh sovereign kingship. This is a notion which was cited in opposition to an appeal in 1945 to add a Welsh representation to the UK flag, which was denied on the basis that Wales was never a kingdom and has only ever been a principality. But here's where it gets interesting. The title Prince of Wales is actually an allusion to Principe, meaning first principle. The title, which is shown clearly above Llewellyn in this picture, rather meaning prince, as in below a king. Principe was the title afforded to Roman emperors. Given that the Welsh rulers were largely descended from figures in history such as Maximus or Maxim Wledig and Constantine the Great, it makes sense that the Welsh sovereign rulers were actually claiming their Roman imperial heritage rather than subordinating themselves to the English throne. During the period following the annexation of Wales, it is evident that the sentiments contained within the Comrick histories must have been influential enough for Edward I to machinate action against it. In 1290, Edward I wrote a letter to Archbishop of Canterbury, John Peckham, asking him to fashion a way to wean the Welsh from their Trojan fantasies and prophecies of a return to sovereignty over Britain. The letter to Archbishop Peckham illustrates the ongoing political significance to the Cambrian narrative and its significance to the Welsh and their sense of aboriginality to the island. On the topic of the usage of Comrick histories, it is evident that Edward I harboured a degree of understanding in relation to the significance of certain places within the Welsh landscape. The point in which Harlech Castle is built was traditionally regarded by the Welsh as the home of King Bendigeid Ran, whose statue is displayed next to the castle built by Edward I. This manoeuvre can illustrate that Edward I had detailed knowledge about the mythological content of the Welsh cultural psyche, which he evidently wielded to establish a physical as well as a metaphysical dominance over the Welsh in the 13th century. The Plantagenets understood British history and were able to conduct political manoeuvres associated with it. Regarding both Henry II and Edward I, both examples can be seen as a wielding of the political power of this narrative for the benefit of these statesmen, which was yielded through either a denial or an employment of it. The ascension of the Tudors with Henry Tudor in 1485 evidently incepted a continued and renewed interest in the Brutus and Trojan origins. It must be noted, however, that the style of statesmanship which is inherent to the Tudors meant that these monarchs conspired in a way which acted to disinherit the Britons of their national heritage, while simultaneously wielding it for themselves exclusively for legitimation. This can be understood when examining the historical revision delivered by Polydore Virgil. The Italian-English ecclesiastic scholar was a proponent of humanism. Virgil's humanist background would have rendered Virgil privy to the retrospective interest in Greco-Roman philosophy, which influenced the development and a usage of critical analysis, which would be applied to Britain's history in order to sanitize it of its mytho-poetic essence. As an agent of the Pope, Virgil was deployed to various posts in England. It is evident that a re-evaluation of England's history would be one of them. Virgil came to England from Italy in 1502 and was received well. Virgil became close with Henry VII. The Tudor king was impressed by humanism and critical analysis and asked Virgil to write a history of England in the hope that this new philosophical school of thought would be able to bring Britain's narrative up to date as well as support the Tudor claim. The History of the Kings of Britain by Geoffrey of Monmouth was attacked by Polydore Virgil, and Monmouth's work was seen as discredited. The Trojan narrative and the historical accounts of King Arthur, as well as the history of the Apostolic Church and the presence of the Holy Family in Britain, were confined to the realm of fairy tale. Polydore wrote Anglica Historia, which became the new standard of history of England. and his first criticism was to express doubt in the existence of Arthur and Brutus, and would work to discredit their reality immediately. The mythologisation of these historical figures of Arthur and Brutus, as conducted by the medieval traditionalists, can conceivably act as the basis for their discreditation in the eyes of an early modern humanist interested in emphasising the secular. Another motivation might be that Virgil wished to sanitise Henry VII's England and Wales of the old narrative as part of an operation to consolidate the English crown into the ultimate royal authority in Britain, as to safeguard the potential to be undermined by any other sons of Brutus. It is also plausible that Virgil may have been interested in further suppressing the narrative of the ancient British Church and the presence of Joseph of Arimathea in Britain, arguably so that Rome would not be undermined by this. This meaning that ecclesiastic power could not be threatened by the return of the Brythonic king line, and their associations with the historical narrative which harboured a degree of threat to the dominance of the Church. Interestingly, in 1617, English jurist Sir Edward Coke states in his legal reports that a British monarch must descend from the line of Brutus as a legal matter, and that Welsh law is senior to English law. This demonstrates a pro-Tudor sentiment by Coke, but it also lets us see that the efforts of Polydore Virgil were not effective enough to cause a total removal of Brutus from the British psyche, and that the ancient Comrick histories were shaping the law of the land in the 17th century. In 1595, Shakespeare co-wrote a tragedy about Locrinus, the first son of Brutus, and describes London as Troynovant, or New Troy, and includes all of the characters from the Brutus histories. This is important, I feel, because it shows that the understanding of this history has not only survived the attempts to eradicate it throughout the ages, but it was being disseminated to the public at the dawning of the 17th century. And here is a map from the middle of the 17th century which labels London as Troynovant, which is written at the bottom corner. And this again shows us that the way to view our past was alive and kicking at this time. One of the topics close to our hearts in the Britons in History group is of course the Welsh presence in America. Interest in the Welsh in America erupted in the 16th century. Elizabeth used this for legitimation of a claim over the Americas in competition with other European powers during a period of colonisation of American land. It must be noted that Elizabeth's heritage was an integral element to this claim. The Tudors hailing from Gwynedd originally and were descendants of Owain Gwynedd, the father of Madog, which is why it was this version of the story being told rather than Arthur II. It must be noted that the reason why the history of the Welsh in America became disregarded was because it was dismissed by King James I in a diplomatic letter to Spain in 1621, which was being written to ensure good relations between Britain and Spain. And there is evidence to suggest that the story of the Welsh in America was a popular one during the 17th century also. The Americas would prove to be a source of great intrigue for those looking for the lost tribes of Israel during the English Civil War. The traditional Comrick history erupted into playing a huge part during the English Revolution as well. John Sadler, private secretary to Oliver Cromwell, wrote a pamphlet named Rights of the Kingdom. Within the pamphlet, Sadler made numerous references to laws and other cultural artefacts from the Greeks, Trojans and Israelites. These cultural references provided a fresh perspective to the origin narrative of the native Britons, which was flavoured by a parliamentarian impulse to create a new post-monarchical British identity, which would oppose the Norman yoke through incorporating the lost heritage which had been denied to the people of Britain by the Church and the monarchy. Sadler did this through citing Israelite relics in Britain, which he did through emphasising what he called Jewish disciplines within the British Apostolic Church, which is active until the 11th century. Trojan relics, such as Welsh land tenure laws as well. Sadler says that besides the presence of Troynovant in London, the relics of Troy are to be found within Wales and Cornwall. Sadler cites the gravel kind, which is a British system of land tenure which is associated with the distribution of land and resources after the death of a family head. Sadler also mentions the British continuation of the democratic process, which we got from the Greeks. And Sadler also mentions the British alphabet, which he says came from the Phoenicians. I think that Sadler wished to depict the British as the natural inheritors of both the Greek world and the Judeo-Christian world through the images of Greek democracy entwined with a Mosaic deliverance from the Pharaoh, which would not only emphasise for legitimation of regicide as part of the Protestant interest in Hebraism in revolutionary Britain. This interest in Jewish monastic teachings facilitated the tacit readmission of the Jews into England in 1655. Sadler also addresses the contemporary historiographical debates during this period. He does this by introducing William Camden's notion of a kinship between the Britons and the Gauls, which Sadler expresses doubt over, a notion which J.R.R. Tolkien would have agreed with. Sadler also notes that he does not entertain the works of Gerald of Wales, Matthew Paris or Roger Hovenden, or anyone else who dismisses Geoffrey of Monmouth. It is important to note here that these scholars were proponents of the Norman view of the Welsh and their history, which is often flavoured by disdain and colonial attitude. It is conceivable here that Sadler is keen to illustrate a sort of systematic derision of the Comrick view of history, which also exists within a polarity of opposition in relation to the treatment of this narrative by earlier Norman monarchs. In other words, Sadler is illustrating that the Normans both wielded the Cambrian narrative and were later responsible for the early derision of it, which demonstrates the political undertone of its usage by them, which is regulated by opportunism. This mention of William Camden's history by Sadler is also interesting because it, to me, shows the point at which the modern Celticisation began and how it relied on the earlier Anglo-Norman derision of the ancient British and their understanding of history. During the English Revolution, the ideological syncretism between Protestant Judaizers in England and Rabbi Israel ben Manasseh's missionary attempt to locate the lost tribes of Israel resulted in the correspondence between both parties, which led not only to the tacit readmission of the Jews into England, but also the inception of a Hebraist college in London, which was started with the aim of making Jewish teachings accessible to Puritans. This collaboration contributed to the matter of the Jewish question during the special conference in Whitehall in December 1655, which bore witness to the permission by consensus of the tacit readmission of the Jews back into England for the first time since their expulsion by Edward I in 1290. Manasseh's The Hope of Israel was the document which started the discussion. The document emphasised the mistreatment of both the Jews and the Welsh within Britain by the Plantagenet King Edward I. The document also discusses an ancient Jewish prophecy of Jewish settlement in all corners of the world before the coming of the Messiah. This prophecy was met with a good amount of theological syncretism within the Puritan belief that the conversion of all the Jews to Christianity would be a necessary precondition for the second coming of Christ. Manasseh's campaign for the Jewish readmission was not initially well received in England, however, with his petition delivered by his representative Manuel Martinez Domingo being rejected by the Council of State in 1654. Manasseh's visit to Cromwell in 1655, however, seems to have incepted a process which saw the Jews legally readmitted to England. An element which contributed to this was Cromwell's tendency to listen to anyone who wished to have dialogue with him. Another element which aided Manasseh was Cromwell's positive personal experience with the helpful Jewish merchants. Cromwell agreed to hold the debate at Whitehall, but abstained from showing support for the readmission. The conference at Whitehall was debated amongst legal, economic and political personages. The opposition to the notion of readmission was led by William Prynne, who was responsible for the dissemination of racially anti-Semitic propaganda which focused on small Jewish communities already living in England. I've included this to try and illustrate that not only was the Comrick histories playing a huge role in shaping British identity in the Civil War, but was also influencing foreign policy as well. One name in the canon of the British bards which I couldn't leave at this stage without mentioning was of course Iolo. It occurred to me pretty early on that the exoneration of this man would be an instrumental thing for the recognition of British history once more. And the more I looked into Iolo, the stronger I felt about arguing the case for a retrial of his contributions. One of the artefacts which is linked with the scandalous smear campaign against Iolo is of course the accusation of an invented Colburn alphabet. Some of you who've seen my videos will know that I've spent some time looking over ancient stones in Britain with my dad, with the intention of cracking the code to the language. On the inscriptions, paying particular attention to the relationship between Welsh and Latin. I've also been keeping a keen eye out for Colburn and the ciphers which Iolo had been accused of forging. There are 55 inscribed stones in Wales bearing an inscription style which is unique to both Britain and Ireland, called Ogham. The Ogham stones in Wales are more common in places closer to Ireland, and it's said often that that's due to an ecclesiastical correspondence between Wales and Ireland, basically being an Irish import, in other words. However, this point is arguable due to the fact that the British stones are unique in that they harbour a usage of so-called bad Latin as well as an Ogham script. And it has been noted that the usage of this bad Latin on Welsh stones holds a special intermixture of both the straight-stroke runic cipher, which some scholars admit is a British script, and Latin, which accounts for the coinage of the term bad Latin. However, none of the stones in Ireland contemporary to those in Wales harbour either a usage of bad Latin or an intermixture of a British Latin script. It's unlikely then that this is an import, and rather it's more likely that the runic cipher was a product of British culture, and that the intermixture of the usage of this and the Latin script is a product of Romano-British commerce. Through the study of these stones, I have for myself pinpointed the majority of the characters within Iolo's reproduction, and I'm absolutely confident that I'll be able to find the rest when I have a chance to have a look at some more stones. An argument I gave in my dissertation was that given that most of Iolo's alphabet characters are visible on British stones, and given that the alphabet is recorded and mentioned as a bona fide British cultural artefact by Julius Caesar, Strabo and Nennius, it is unfair to accuse Iolo of inventing it. I hope to see a fair retrial of Iolo in the coming years. That's all, and thanks for listening.